The origins of the plague. As the deadliest pandemic in recorded history, the Black Plague killed an estimated 50 million people in Europe and the Mediterranean between 1346 and 1356. It was one of those periods in the history of mankind that has haunted scientists for nearly 700 years. And it all started because of rats. Well, technically a bacterium called Yersinia pestis was the one responsible, but rats and fleas helped to facilitate its spread. You see, the Yersinia pestis was first discovered in Central Asia around the early 1330s. You see, during this area, Central Asia was one of the hotspots for trading, so when ships came back from Crimea and Asia, the first places they officially landed was in Messina, Sicily. But unknown to these merchants, they were easily transporting the rats who carried this bacterium. I mean, black rats were agile, adaptable, and frequent stowaways on merchant ships, so they were in every true sense the perfect middlemen. Now, of course, when the ships docked, the black rats started to leave and mingle amongst the city dwellers, and this gave the bacterium the perfect opportunity to start its deathly descent of humanity. Plus, in the 1330s, the climate change and natural disasters threw the ecosystem out of whack, so the heat helped it thrive. Nature literally told these guys, "Welcome to the worst time of your life." The spread along the Silk Road, 1330s to 1340s. Now, we already established that merchants and rats were ones spreading the Black Plague, but the Mongol army also really helped out the pandemic. During the war, their leader, Kipchak Khan Janibeg, while he was fighting to seize the Genoese trading post in Kaffa, which is our modern-day Feodosia, Crimea, realized that his men were dropping like flies as a result of this unknown sickness. So Khan Janibeg thought it was a brilliant idea to catapult plague-infected corpses into the town in an effort to weaken and infect their enemies. Well, his plan worked flawlessly, because not only did he infect his enemies, he also managed to infect half the continent, because as Genoese merchants fled Kaffa, they carried the plague aboard their ships and set sail to various Mediterranean ports, where it spread inland, affecting Sicily, North Africa, Spain, and the Low Countries in 1349. Stages of the Black Plague. You see, the Black Plague had three varieties. The bubonic plague, which was the most commonly seen during the Black Death, with a mortality rate of 30 to 75%. Then the pneumonic plague was the airborne variant that attacked the lungs first, before the rest of the body. Pneumonic plague was the second most commonly seen form during the Black Death, with a mortality rate of 90 to 95%. And the septicemic plague came in the form of deadly blood poisoning. The disease is contracted primarily through the bite of an infected insect, and this variant caused disseminated intravascular coagulation, which is a serious medical situation where blood starts clotting uncontrollably throughout the body. I mean, even touching the blood or body of a sick person also spread the Black Death. Now, if you were amongst the unfortunate millions who got the plague, the first symptoms would show up as extremely painful and swollen lymph nodes. Then, painful swellings called buboes that were sometimes the size of an apple or an egg would start appearing around the base of your neck, in the armpits, and groin area, and they usually ooze pus and blood. These would be followed by a host of other unpleasant symptoms: fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, terrible aches and pains all over your body. Honestly, humanity didn't stand a chance against this disease from the very beginning. So it should come as no surprise that after the plague-infected ships arrived in Messina, Sicily on October 1347, the Black Death began to spread like wildfire to major ports like Genoa and Venice, and within 1 year, the plague had pretty much engulfed the whole of Europe, including France, Spain, and England. Urban outbreaks and devastation, 1348 to 1350. You see, the importance of hygiene was not recognized until the 19th century and the germ theory of disease. There was literally so much filth inside urban Europe that French and Italian cities were naming streets after human waste. In medieval Paris, several street names were inspired by merde, the French word for shit. There were Rue Mordu, Rue Mordelais, Rue Mordauson, Rue des Mordants. Well, you get the point. In fact, they considered bathing a temptation, and it was barely permitted. So when the plague came by in 1348, it had the perfect environment to thrive. It was so bad that people were dropping like flies every day. Someone could go to sleep healthy and be dead the very next morning as a result of the plague. Parents abandoned their sick children to die alone, and entire households were sealed off to contain the disease. The guys who could afford it were fleeing to the countryside, but there was no safety there also. The plague didn't just kill humans, but also affected the livestock and sheep in the millions. In one place, over 5,000 sheep dropped dead in a single pasture, and their bodies were so decayed that no animal would even come close to them. Basically, the sheer scale of death was apocalyptic. It got so bad that entire cities were completely reduced to ghost towns, and in some cases, up to 60% of the population died, which means that 3 out of every 5 that got the disease didn't live to tell the story. Burial sites were overflowing with infected corpses. People started getting buried in mass graves that became known as plague pits. Plague doctors. Now, with doctors, priests, and traditional medicine proving useless, a group of people came into the scene and became known as the plague doctors. These eerie figures wore long black robes, wide-brimmed hats, and their infamous beaked masks, which were stuffed with aromatic herbs like rosemary, lavender, and mint. They were basically medieval Europe's equivalent of hazmat-suited frontline workers. Now, the whole idea of dressing up like huge black birds with large beaks was because the prevailing theory was that the plague spread through miasma, or bad air, and the scented mask was meant to filter it. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Most plague doctors had little to no formal medical training and were hired by desperate cities to record deaths and offer rudimentary care, which basically made things worse. Their idea of treatment options included bloodletting, burning aromatic fires, or ingesting mercury. Yeah, ingesting more poison was definitely the solution. However, despite the fact that they weren't able to provide any sort of solution and that their presence was often a symbol of death, they still helped communities compile the public records of player deaths. Social and religious reactions. Amidst all the chaos and deaths, society sought answers. The unprecedented mortality rate and the complete breakdown of normal life was very alarming to the ones who were still alive. What had they done to deserve this sort of punishment? Some people even started to believe that the plague was divine punishment from God. It wasn't just a disease, but Judgment Day in slow motion. It got worse when the priests and church body, who were supposed to be a beacon of hope and faith, started dropping like flies too. Some priests would even refuse to come near the infected, or even perform last rites for the dead. So, in an effort to seek God's forgiveness, some religious zealots started a practice called self-flagellation. Basically, they'd whip themselves so much with leather straps embedded with sharp objects. They'd do this on the streets, completely naked, chanting and crying. The idea was that the more pain they inflicted, the more likely God would hear their cries and end the plague. Imagine seeing your neighbor in a parade of self-harm, crying out prayers and dripping with sweat and blood. It was like a medieval horror film with live actors. But then, the idea was a complete dumb move, because their gatherings and painful bloodletting basically helped to spread the plague even more. The scapegoating of the Jews. And then, when flogging themselves mercilessly wasn't doing anything but making people sicker, they turned the blame to the Jews, who during this time were already marginalized and mistrusted in many parts of Europe. The Jews became the primary scapegoats as conspiracy theories started to circulate that they were the ones poisoning wells and rivers to deliberately cause the disease. I mean, the Jews were literally dying in the thousands also, so how does that even make sense? According to their theory, the Jews weren't dying as much as the rest of the people, but it was actually just because the Jews practiced better hygiene due to cultural and religious customs, such as regular washing before prayers and strict dietary laws. This may have slightly reduced their exposure to the plague, but instead of recognizing these practices as helpful, the masses interpreted them as evidence of a sinister plot. Sadly, this unfounded accusation led to pogroms, aka organized massacres and expulsions of Jewish communities. Entire villages were wiped out, and in some cities, such as Strasbourg, Jewish residents were burned alive in horrific public executions. These acts weren't isolated, but were widespread and often supported, or at least tolerated, by the local authorities. How do you go from seeking ultimate repentance to burning another person alive for no evident reason? Temporary decline, 1350 to 1360s. Eventually, by 1350, after almost 2 decades of disease and death, the Black Death finally stopped acting like an overachieving student acing its Wreck Europe final exam. The pandemic began to ease, but it wasn't because humanity got its act together or suddenly discovered hand sanitizer. Nope, the plague basically ran out of fuel. For real though, the plague killed so many people that it basically started running out of new victims. It was like a party where the DJ played the same terrible song so often that everyone just left. And the people who survived the Black Death weren't just lucky, they were walking immune systems with legs, because their bodies had been able to fight off the disease, thus making them resistant to future infections. But the crisis wasn't over. Collapse and economic chaos. You see, what made the Black Death so disastrous isn't the fact that it just wiped out people, it literally tore through the very fabric of society. With so many people dead, the feudal lords who relied on a rigid hierarchy of lords and peasants found themselves in crisis. Landowners who were once powerful faced a dire shortage of labor, and with fewer workers available, surviving peasants realized their worth and began demanding higher wages and better conditions, a direct challenge to the existing social order. These labor shortages forced wages upward and broke the chains of serfdom in many places. Peasants who once were bound to the land found newfound mobility, and the rigid feudal economy built on unpaid labor could no longer sustain itself. And as the desperation spread, crime soared because there were no more police officers. They were either dead, simply didn't care anymore, or just overwhelmed by everything happening. The legal system, which was already fragile, struggled to function, and in some areas, justice became a distant memory. Meanwhile, wealth was redistributed as inheritances piled up, so if you were lucky enough to survive and inherit Aunt Marjorie's estate, you might suddenly find yourself a medieval millionaire. The second pandemic, 1360s to 1370s. But if you thought the Black Death had finished its grim world tour in the 1350s, think again. Like the horror movie villain who refuses to stay dead, the plague made a comeback in the 1360s. This wave became infamously known as the pestilence of children, because this time around, the plague targeted younger populations, who tragically lacked immunity to the disease. The kids were basically playing a medieval game of tag with death, and spoiler alert, death didn't play fair. Technically, the first wave had already done its big one and taken out all the vulnerable population, so ones who survived had grown quite immune to the bacteria. However, all the kids born after the first wave were like a fresh buffet for Yersinia pestis, and boy did they feast. To make matters worse, they still had no cure for the plague, so it was back to bloodletting, herbs, or just hoping really hard that your child made it to morning. The plague probably sat back and laughed while they waved posies around, as if flowers were some kind of anti-plague force field. By the late 1300s, it was clear that the plague was not a single isolated event, but rather a recurring disease that would define European history for centuries. These periodic resurgences ensured that fear of the plague remained deeply ingrained in the collective consciousness of everyone. Treatments. After this new resurgence, people actually started connecting the dots and becoming smarter. They realized that the disease was spread when people came in close proximity to infected individuals. So any ship suspected of carrying plague was detained, or rather quarantined at ports for 40 days. Sailors and merchants were always inspected, and anyone found showing symptoms of the goods were just left to die on board. By the end of the 14th century, Europeans started coming up with more medical cures and preventative measures. In fact, they even started advising people to take baths regularly with vinegar and rose water, and sometimes in their own urine. Yeah, that's wrong, but at least it's the thought that counts. Now, it is important to understand that the Black Death really never disappeared, though. It simply scaled down from its catastrophic opening act in the 14th century to a long-running, intermittent horror show. After its initial devastation, the plague became endemic, meaning it settled into a pattern of recurring, localized outbreaks that haunted Europe for centuries. This deadly encore popped up when least expected, to remind everyone it was still a force to be reckoned with. One of the most infamous resurgences was the Great Plague of London in 1665 to 1666. And this time around, the Great Plague killed around 100,000 people, which is a staggering 20% of London's population. The final eradication. The Black Death eventually lost its grip on humanity, not because it had a change of heart, but because humans finally fought back with some serious weapons, like science, hygiene, and most importantly, soap. Yes, something as simple as washing hands turned out to be a game changer. If only medieval guys had known that instead of waving incense sticks around, they just needed to scrub-a-dub-dub their hands, they might have avoided centuries of misery. Basically, by the 19th century, improved sanitation and urban planning meant fewer rats crashing in people's homes like unwanted house guests. Cities started installing proper sewage systems, which meant people stopped casually dumping waste into streets like it was some sort of medieval garbage parade. Cleaner streets meant fewer fleas, and fewer fleas meant less plague. It was the ultimate out-of-sight, out-of-plague strategy. Then the hero that cleaned up the problem came into the picture in the 20th century. When Yersinia pestis met the streptomycin antibiotic, it was a game-changer for humans. Suddenly, what had once been a planet-shaking, civilization-wrecking disease could now be defeated with a simple pill. If the plague had a personality, it would have packed its bags in humiliation. So even though the plague isn't completely extinct, as it still pops up in small outbreaks, especially in rural areas, modern medicine is like a cheat code that stops it in its tracks. Public health measures like quarantines, rapid responses, and antibiotics ensured that the plague went from a global superstar to a forgotten relic.